My name is Helen, and I turned 30 years old recently. Many years ago, I foolishly thought that my love could fix all of his problems. Therefore, I chose to marry a man who had a lot of problems. I believed I could make him see how valuable he is. But regrettably, love has its limitations and cannot make someone love themselves. I'm going to call my former spouse Scott. He was driven beyond the typical desire to make his parents proud and developed an extreme preoccupation with pleasing them. This obsessive demand for their acceptance dominated his entire life. I'll refer to Scott's parents as Mr. and Mrs. Kyle. Scott was more in need of their attention because they didn't seem to care about him. It hurt to watch, and I quickly realized that I was unable to make up for the emotional gap they left in him. To make matters worse, Scott would often spend our funds on lavish presents and trips for his parents, using up our money for things they almost ever utilized. Our relationship suffered greatly as a result of his careless spending, which turned into a constant subject of contention between us, and made me feel like I was competing with his parents for his attention. Even with all the problems and the never-ending arguments, I still harbored feelings for Scott. I clung to the notion that he would rise above the impractical standards his parents had set for him and discover true fulfillment in himself. It was painfully obvious that Scott's parents' bad influences could not be kept at bay by my love alone. One day, things became serious when Scott walked up to me and gave me a serious face, like he had something important to talk about. Considering the ups and downs of our relationship, I prepared myself for something extreme because I felt this discussion would lead to our most heated argument to date. "Helen, there's something important I need to talk about," he began with a grave tone. "What's going on?" I asked, my heart sinking in anticipation of bad news. "It's about my parents. They're retiring soon, and I want to surprise them with a luxury vacation. It's going to be quite expensive," he revealed, his face a mix of excitement and anxiety. "That sounds nice, as long as the money comes from your personal savings." "I really don't want to dip into our joint savings again," I responded, hoping to steer clear of another financial argument. "I don't have enough to cover it on my own." "I was hoping we could use some of our savings," Scott admitted, his expression torn between hope and concern. "Scott, if it's more than we can afford, maybe we should reconsider this expense," I suggested gently, trying to anchor him back to reality. However, my words only upset him. "You just don't understand, Helen. I love my parents and want to do something special for them. Love isn't about counting every penny. It's about grand gestures," he argued with passion. I countered, but love is also about being there for each other and making sacrifices together, not at the expense of our financial stability. This trip might be important to them, but we need to think about our future too. Scott remained adamant. "I have to do this for them. I thought you of all people would understand. They're everything to me," he implored. "And you're everything to me, Scott, but we have to be practical. We can't just use all our savings on one trip," I reasoned, searching for a middle ground. Instead, he accused me of being selfish and not seeing the importance of his gesture. "It's not about being selfish. It's about being sensible and planning for our future," I explained, my anxiety growing as he mentioned he needed all of our savings. "All of our savings, Scott? That's just reckless," I exclaimed, stunned by his request. "You're being heartless," he shot back, convinced I couldn't grasp his desire to make his parents happy. "No, Scott, I'm being realistic," I replied, feeling the chasm between us widen with each word. "We can't afford to spend $35,000 on a whim." His nonchalant assumption that we could simply get the money back later only deepened my irritation. "Really, Scott? That's not how this works," I replied, my disbelief palpable. We were deadlocked, and our perspectives on love, responsibility, and finances were poles apart. The argument escalated, voices raised, and in the heated moment, items were hurled and shattered, our frustration manifesting physically. Amidst the turmoil, Scott dropped a bombshell, declaring that if I couldn't support him, he wanted a divorce. He likely expected me to react with panic, desperate to salvage our marriage. Instead, I summoned all my calm and resolve, and simply said, "Okay, Scott, if that's truly what you want." The shock was evident on his face. He had anticipated tears and pleas, but instead, he met my unwavering stance. I was done catering to his fantasies. If he chose to squander his future on unattainable dreams, he would do so alone. I held nothing back, expressing my thoughts clearly. His ceaseless pursuit of his parents' approval was futile, like trying to stay dry in a storm with just an umbrella. He attempted to counter, but I silenced him with a simple raise of my hand, declaring my refusal to continue fighting for a love hindered by unrealistic expectations and an incessant need for validation. Go ahead, spend all your money trying to win over people who barely notice you. I told him, resolute in my decision to end the cycle of disappointments and broken promises. With that, the stark reality struck him. Our marriage had morphed into a battlefield, and it was time to surrender and seek peace separately. A month has passed since our divorce was finalized, and I must say the sense of liberation is profound. Gone are the exhausting arguments over finances and the futile quest for approval that was never ours to claim. Now I breathe easier, freed from the oppressive weight of his insecurities that once clouded my days. Each new day now shines a bit brighter. True, Scott has attempted to re-enter my life, feigning concern and inquiring about my well-being, but I see through his charade. I'm not about to be deceived again. As the old saying goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I resolutely turned away from Scott's attempts to rekindle our past relationship. I had come to understand that I invested too much in trying to mend someone who had no desire to change. It was now time to prioritize my personal growth and happiness. Rebuilding my life wasn't easy, to say the least. Splitting our shared assets and adapting to a new financial reality required patience and resilience. Although I was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, I was no stranger to adaptation and welcomed the challenge to reshape my life. As I embarked on this journey of self-discovery, I uncovered a strength and independence I never knew I possessed. Reconnecting with old friends, resuming hobbies I had put aside, and exploring new interests opened up a world brimming with possibilities. I was determined to seize this fresh start. Yes, there were moments filled with self-doubt and loneliness, and adjusting to a tighter budget was tough. The scars from a failed marriage don't vanish overnight. But with each day, I found solace in knowing that I was no longer compromising my happiness to cater to someone else's insecurities. The relative ease with which I moved forward was perhaps indicative of how long I had clung to a relationship that was doomed. It was astonishing to see how much I could achieve once I was liberated from that emotional burden. A month into this new chapter, I was still adjusting but feeling more empowered than ever. Amidst this transformation, Scott's messages took on a new tone. He claimed he was in danger and urgently needed to meet. Weary of his relentless attempts to reach out, I decided it was time to address the situation head-on. Amid his ongoing pleas, I called him. "Scott, we've been over this. We're divorced. It's time for us to move on," I said with firmness. "Helen, please, I just need a moment to explain. I'm in serious trouble, and you're the only one I can turn to for help," he implored, his voice perhaps carrying a genuine tone of fear. Or maybe it was just the absence of hearing his voice that made it seem so. Whether it was the long silence since our last heartfelt conversation, or his seemingly sincere distress. A part of me was intrigued yet cautious about his intentions. Despite my reservations, I agreed to meet Scott. Fine, but we're not meeting at my place. Let's go to that cafe we used to frequent. No tricks, understood. I stipulated. Thank you, Helen. I promise I just need someone to listen. You're the only one who understands me, he replied, sounding genuinely relieved. You might be wondering why I would agree to meet Scott after everything that happened. Truthfully, I questioned my own decision. Yet sometimes, curiosity and a lingering concern, no matter how faint, compel us to act against our better judgment. I couldn't completely dismiss his plea. Divorced or not, I couldn't deny that part of me still cared. So there we were, sitting across from each other in the cozy cafe, enveloped in the comforting aroma of coffee. However, not even the familiar soothing environment could ease the tension. Watching Scott with anxiety etched across his face, and those deliberately sad eyes trying to tug at my heartstrings, was almost comical. This time, though, I remained unmoved. I leaned back, composed and in control, prepared to listen but determined to keep the conversation on my terms. Okay, Scott, you have my attention for now. What's this danger you're supposedly in? Just so you know, I'm not here to save you. I'm done cleaning up your messes, I stated, my tone firm yet open to hearing him out. Scott sighed deeply, his face a blend of regret and desperation that was almost pitiable. But I steeled myself against any emotional manipulation. I know I've made mistakes before, Helen, but this situation is different. I've gotten involved with some seriously bad people. I owe them a lot of money, and they're not known for their patience, he confessed. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical of his melodramatic tale. Really, Scott? Dangerous people? Are we revisiting the tale of your imaginary friends who seem to attract trouble? I couldn't hide my disbelief. Scott's expression shifted to one of hurt and frustration, evidently hoping for a more sympathetic response. No, Helen, this isn't made up. I'm in deep trouble, and coming to you is my last resort, he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. Let me guess, you spiraled after our divorce. I continued, piecing together the predictable pattern of his post-separation choices. As Scott shared his predicament, my voice unintentionally rose, attracting the attention of other cafe patrons. I shot them an apologetic look, trying to regain my composure. Look, I got caught up in something foolish, I admit, but now I'm in a mess that's bigger than I can handle alone, Scott confessed, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. My frustration was close to boiling over. How could he just waltz back into my life with yet another crisis? Yet beneath my irritation, a faint shadow of empathy lingered. How much are you in for? I asked, bracing myself for the answer. $120,000, Scott responded sheepishly. $120,000, Scott. Are you out of your mind? My outburst was louder this time, drawing sharp glances from around the cafe. I didn't bother with an apology. Anyone overhearing our conversation would likely understand my reaction. Helen, please, I'm begging you. I've got nowhere else to turn. I know I've made a mess of things, but you're the one person who really believed in me, Scott pleaded, his eyes glistening with a sincerity that momentarily reminded me of the man I once loved. But those days were long gone, and my priority now was self-preservation, even if it meant walking away from him. Don't pull at my heartstrings, Scott. It's way too late for that. When you said you needed help, I thought you meant maybe $20,000, not $120,000. You've completely lost it, I responded, my voice a mix of disbelief and indignation. Overwhelmed, Scott began to cry, seemingly oblivious to the uncomfortable glances from other patrons. Scott, calm down. "This isn't the place for a scene," I said firmly. "What's going to happen if you don't pay this back?" "They're threatening to harm me, Helen. I'm not joking. This is really bad," he managed between sobs. His words hung heavy in the air, leaving me torn between my lingering concern for his well-being and the need to protect myself from being dragged back into his chaos. Seeing the seriousness of his situation, I was forced to consider the gravity of the risk he faced. I softened my approach. "All right, Scott, start from the beginning and tell me everything," I urged gently. He then recounted his attempts to fund an extravagant trip for his parents. He had borrowed money, trusting a friend who ultimately let him down, plunging him deep into debt. As he narrated his missteps, I felt a mix of frustration at his reckless decisions and a reluctant amusement at the outcome. "So you borrowed money from risky people to impress your parents, who hadn't even noticed your efforts? Is that what happened?" I asked, seeking clarity on the sequence of events. Scott's expression fell, and tears streamed down his face as he faced the painful truth. "Yes, ever since they went on that trip, it's like I don't matter to them," he confessed, his voice laden with regret. Even though I was irritated, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him. It was a harsh lesson for Scott, and seeing him so remorseful stirred a compassionate response within me. "You've really gotten yourself into a tough spot," I remarked. "Scott, I know you don't want to hear 'I told you so,' but you did create this mess yourself. I warned you it wasn't a good idea, and now, after choosing to leave me over it, here you are struggling. You invested everything in trying to make your parents happy, but all you received in return was their indifference. It's a hard lesson, but it's one you needed to learn," I explained, feeling a mix of concern and resignation. This was a bitter truth for both of us. Scott had pegged his self-worth on people who couldn't appreciate his sacrifices, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I couldn't shield him from his own decisions. I hoped that confronting these tough consequences would help him realize that I had always been on his side, but his relentless quest for parental approval was his undoing. As we sat in silence, the weight of our shared past, filled with broken promises and unrealized dreams, was palpable. I realized it was time to completely let go. No more second chances, no more attempts to mend what was beyond repair. Scott needed to confront the outcomes of his actions on his own, and I needed to move forward and find my path to happiness. "I hope you find a way out of this, Scott," I said, my voice carrying a firm tone of finality. "You're not going to help?" Scott asked, looking genuinely surprised. "No, I'm not," I replied. "Why not?" he pressed. "Because I don't have the money to bail you out. And even if I did, taking on a huge loan that I'd be paying off for years isn't something I can afford." "I can't afford to be as reckless as you've been," I explained, my tone steady and unwavering. "Come on, Helen, please. I'm begging you," he pleaded, his desperation palpable. "Scott, expecting me to fix this for you, especially given how you're acting, isn't realistic," I said, feeling my patience thinning. "Yeah, I did expect that." "You're my ex-wife, not my enemy," he replied, still clinging to a shred of hope. But it was clear our lives had taken different paths. My focus now was on securing my peace and happiness, separate from the chaos that once intertwined our lives. And that's the problem, Scott. You expect me to always be there to clean up your mess because that's what I used to do. I was your wife, so helping you out of trouble was something I did naturally. But I can't and shouldn't keep doing that. It's not my responsibility anymore," I continued. "After everything, I don't owe you anything, especially considering how our money was wasted on your ungrateful and toxic parents." "But I love them," Scott said, his voice softening. "And I love myself too. Loving myself means doing what's best for me, including taking care of my well-being, I countered. Scott cast a downward glance as he realized he wouldn't be getting the assistance he desired from me. I knew how desperate he was, so I gave him one final bit of advice. As it appears that you have no other options, I would advise you to leave. Go to a remote location where they can't find you. With a steady yet determined tone, I turned to face Scott and stated, "I'm not sure what more you're asking of me." He sat silently, obviously disappointed that I had turned down his request for assistance this time. "Scott, it's time for us to go down different roads." I tried explaining, hoping he would understand the seriousness of what I was saying. "I can no longer allow myself to be enmeshed in your troubles. Each of us must seek out our own peace." There was a trace of bitterness in his remark. "If you truly cared, you would assist," he said in an irate tone. "I'm going to say goodbye, Scott." I stood up and walked away, adamantly declaring, "I'm also changing my phone number." I left him sitting there by himself, a confusing mix of emotions on his face. I had to make a difficult but necessary decision for my happiness and dignity.